They found her access card at the perimeter fence at 0400 hours. Her jacket abandoned near the eastern gate. Security protocols initiated a base-wide search for the missing junior officer. Admiral Hutchinson assumed the worst: kidnapping, defection, or worse. But Irene Hill wasn't lost. She was methodically documenting every security breach, every blind spot, every failure that made his naval base vulnerable. And by the time they found her, she'd already compiled enough evidence to end careers. This is the story of the officer they underestimated, and the unauthorized inspection that changed everything. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out, subscribe now for more. The Mediterranean sun hadn't yet broken the horizon when Irene Hill completed her final equipment check. She stood in the shadows behind Building 7 of Naval Base Constantia, her dark hair pulled back tight, her uniform deliberately missing any identification beyond her rank insignia. In her backpack, carefully packed between regulation items, were tools that would have raised questions if anyone had bothered to search her: a digital camera with a telephoto lens, a notebook filled with security protocol documentation, and a portable scanner that could detect electronic surveillance gaps. She was 26 years old, slight in build, with the kind of face that people forgot 5 minutes after meeting her. That forgettability had become her greatest asset. For 11 months, she'd served as assistant protocol officer at Constantia, a position so bureaucratic and mundane that most personnel couldn't even explain what she actually did. They saw her carrying clipboards, updating procedure manuals, sitting in the back of briefings taking notes that no one ever read. What they didn't see was the pattern she'd been mapping. The security failures that kept her awake at night. The vulnerabilities that made their entire base a potential target. The morning briefing was scheduled for 0700 hours, but Irene had been awake since 0200. She'd watched the guard rotations from her quarters window, timing the gaps between patrols. She'd studied the camera coverage maps that she'd officially requested as part of her protocol duties, maps that revealed more blind spots than coverage. She'd documented 13 separate instances where security procedures were ignored, modified, or simply forgotten by personnel who'd grown complacent after years without incidents. Nobody had listened when she'd tried to raise concerns through proper channels. 3 months ago, she'd submitted a detailed report to Commander Petrakis, her direct supervisor, outlining potential security vulnerabilities in the base perimeter. Petrakis had glanced at the 30-page document and set it aside with a dismissive wave. "Hill, our security has been adequate for 15 years. I don't need a protocol officer telling decorated security personnel how to do their jobs." 2 months ago, she'd attempted to discuss her concerns with Lieutenant Colonel Dreyfus during a routine briefing. He'd interrupted her after 2 sentences. "With all due respect, Officer Hill, security analysis isn't your area of expertise. Stick to updating procedure manuals and let the professionals handle base security." 1 month ago, she'd requested a meeting with Admiral Hutchinson himself, hoping that the base commander would take her concerns seriously. His aide had responded with a polite email explaining that the Admiral's schedule didn't permit meetings about routine administrative matters. Routine administrative matters. That's what they'd called the gaps in their defenses, the failures in their protocols, the vulnerabilities that could cost lives. Irene had spent her entire military career being dismissed. She'd graduated 3rd in her class from the Naval Academy, but her requests for field assignments had been consistently denied. "You're better suited for administrative work," her placement officer had explained, apparently unable to imagine that someone who looked like her, small, young, female, might excel at anything beyond paperwork. So she'd accepted the protocol officer position at Constantia, telling herself it was a stepping stone to something more meaningful. Instead, she'd discovered that being invisible had its advantages. People talked freely around her, assuming she wasn't paying attention or wouldn't understand the significance of what they discussed. Guards joked about cutting corners on their patrols. Technical staff complained about surveillance equipment that hadn't been maintained properly. Officers admitted to signing off on security checks they hadn't actually performed. And Irene had documented everything. The notebook in her backpack contained 11 months of careful observation. patrol patterns that had become predictable, camera blind spots that had never been addressed, access points that relied on equipment so outdated that a determined intruder could bypass them with minimal effort. She tried to work within the system, had followed every proper channel, had submitted reports and requested meetings and attempted to raise alarms through official means. The system had failed her completely. So she decided to demonstrate the failures herself. Not through another ignored report, but through direct action that couldn't be dismissed or filed away. She would conduct an unauthorized security inspection, penetrating the base's defenses using nothing but the gaps she'd identified. She would document every failure, every vulnerability, every point where an actual threat could exploit their weaknesses. And when they found her, because she fully intended to be found, she would present them with undeniable evidence that their security was fundamentally compromised. The plan was risky. Career-ending, most likely. She'd be charged with unauthorized activity, with violating security protocols, with insubordination. But Irene had concluded that some things were more important than careers. The safety of the 3,000 personnel stationed at Constantia mattered more than her own future. The security of the naval vessels docked in their harbor mattered more than following a chain of command that refused to listen. She checked her watch, 0412 hours. The guard rotation at the eastern gate would change in 8 minutes. The new guards would spend their first 10 minutes settling in, checking their equipment, receiving the handoff briefing. That 20-minute window was her first opportunity. Irene moved through the shadows between buildings, her steps silent on the concrete paths she'd walked hundreds of times in daylight. She knew every security camera's field of view, every light pool to avoid, every blind spot where the coverage failed. She'd memorized this route over months of careful observation, walking it during daylight hours with her clipboard and her forgettable face, noting every detail that might matter when the moment came. The eastern gate loomed ahead, its chain-link fence topped with razor wire that looked intimidating but hadn't been properly maintained in years. The surveillance camera mounted on the gate post was angled too high, missing the approach entirely, one of the vulnerabilities she'd noted in her unread report. She could hear voices from the guard station. The night shift preparing to hand off to the day shift. Right on schedule. Irene slipped her access card from her pocket and laid it carefully on the ground near the fence, positioning it where it would be found but not immediately. Then she removed her uniform jacket and draped it over a section of fence, making it look abandoned rather than deliberately placed. Creating a narrative. Creating concern. By 0600 hours, someone would find these items and raise an alarm. By 0630, they'd initiate search protocols. By 0700, Admiral Hutchinson would be informed that a junior officer had apparently vanished from the base under suspicious circumstances. And by then, Irene would have penetrated 6 layers of their security, documented failures that couldn't be dismissed as theoretical, and positioned herself to deliver a lesson that no amount of unread reports could provide. She moved to the fence line, finding the section she'd identified 3 months ago where the ground had eroded, creating a gap beneath the chain link just large enough for someone her size to slip through. It was hidden by overgrown vegetation that maintenance crews had neglected, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Irene had known where to look for 11 months. She dropped to her stomach and squeezed through the gap, the rough ground scraping her uniform as she pulled herself under the fence. On the other side, she paused in the darkness, listening for any indication that she'd been detected. Nothing but the distant sound of waves against the harbor breakwater. She was outside the perimeter now, officially off base without authorization. The first of many violations she'd commit before sunrise. Irene checked her watch again and smiled grimly. Right on schedule. The Admiral thought his base was secure. She was about to prove him catastrophically wrong. The terrain beyond the eastern perimeter was rocky Mediterranean hillside, dotted with scrub brush and wild olive trees. Irene moved carefully, using natural cover to avoid sight lines from the base while making her way toward her first objective, the northern observation post that overlooked the naval harbor. According to official security protocols, the observation post was manned 24 hours a day with rotating 2-person teams. According to reality, the reality she'd observed over months of careful attention, the night shift frequently reduced to a single guard who spent most of their time inside the shelter rather than actively observing. The climb took 20 minutes. Irene's small frame, which had been cited so often as a limitation, proved advantageous as she navigated the narrow paths between rocks. She'd hiked this route twice before during off-duty hours, timing herself, identifying the easiest approaches. Now, in the pre-dawn darkness, muscle memory guided her steps. She could see the observation post ahead, a small concrete structure with wide windows overlooking the harbor. A single light glowed inside. Through her small binoculars, she confirmed what she'd suspected: one guard visible, sitting at a desk inside, their attention focused on what appeared to be a mobile phone rather than the harbor they were supposed to be monitoring. Irene raised her camera and began documenting. The timestamp on each photo would be crucial evidence. She photographed the single guard, the unobserved approaches to the post, the clear sight lines that should have made her detection inevitable but hadn't. Then she moved closer, testing how near she could get before being noticed. She reached the observation post's exterior wall without challenge. Through the window, she could see the guard clearly now, watching videos on their phone, headphones in their ears. Completely oblivious. She could have walked through the front door unchallenged. Instead, Irene pulled a small notepad from her pocket and wrote, "Security failure number 1, Northern Observation Post unmanned/distracted. Approached within 5 meters undetected at 0445 hours. Guard wearing headphones, engaged with personal device, no harbor observation conducted during 15-minute observation period." She placed the note under a rock near the post's entrance, where it would eventually be found. Then she moved on to her next objective. The service entrance to the technical buildings was a quarter-mile south, down a maintenance road that was supposed to be regularly patrolled. Irene had walked this road during daylight hours as part of her protocol duties, had noted that the surveillance camera covering the entrance had been non-functional for at least 6 weeks. She'd mentioned this in one of her reports. Nothing had been done. She approached the entrance at 0510 hours. The camera remained non-functional, its lens still covered by the same water damage that had been present weeks ago. The door itself was secured by a keypad lock, but Irene had watched technicians enter their codes dozens of times from her office window across the way. Security protocols required code changes every 30 days. The current code had been in use for 4 months. She entered the code, 7-2-4-9-3. The lock clicked open. Inside, the technical building housed equipment critical to base communications and surveillance systems. It should have been among the most secure locations on the entire base. Instead, Irene found herself walking through darkened corridors without challenge, passing server rooms and equipment lockers that contained the infrastructure for their entire security network. She documented everything with photographs and detailed notes. The unlocked server room doors. The equipment logs that hadn't been updated in months. The fire suppression system that was showing a maintenance error that no one had addressed. Each failure was another piece of evidence, another vulnerability that rendered their security theater rather than actual protection. At 0545 hours, she exited the technical building and made her way toward the harbor itself. This would be the most dangerous part of her unauthorized inspection. The harbor was the heart of Constantia's purpose, home to 3 destroyers and 2 frigates that represented significant national naval assets. Security should be absolute. Irene had identified 4 separate routes to reach the harbor from outside the standard checkpoints. She'd chosen the drainage culvert that ran beneath the harbor perimeter road, a route that should have been secured but wasn't, blocked only by a grate that had been damaged months ago and never repaired. The culvert was cramped and smelled of stagnant water, but it brought her directly to the harbor's edge, emerging near Dock 3 where the destroyer Achilles was moored. She crawled out of the culvert at 0602 hours, her uniform now filthy with mud and grime, and found herself standing on an active naval dock without having encountered a single security checkpoint. She could see the Achilles clearly, could approach within photographing distance of a multi-million-euro naval vessel without challenge. The dock should have had guards posted at regular intervals. She could see one guard, nearly 100 meters away, facing the opposite direction. Irene raised her camera and began documenting the Achilles from angles that should never have been accessible to unauthorized personnel. Each photograph was evidence of catastrophic security failure. Each image proved that everything she tried to tell them through proper channels was not theoretical concern but demonstrated vulnerability. At 0615 hours, she heard the first signs that her absence had been discovered. Radio chatter from the guard near the Achilles, their posture changing from casual boredom to alert attention. Someone had found her access card and jacket. The alarm was being raised. Irene smiled and continued documenting. Let them search. Let them panic. Let them finally understand that their security wasn't adequate, wasn't professional, wasn't anything except a dangerous illusion that she'd just shattered. She moved deeper into the harbor complex, toward the administrative building where Admiral Hutchinson's office overlooked the docks. She had one final objective, one last demonstration that would make her point undeniable. She was going to walk into the Admiral's office and wait for him to arrive for his morning briefing. She was going to sit in his chair, in the heart of his supposedly secure command, and present him with the evidence of every failure she'd documented. The administrative building entrance was secured by both a card reader and a security guard stationed at a desk inside the lobby. Irene approached from the building's eastern side, where a service entrance used by maintenance staff offered an alternative entry. The door was propped open with a concrete block, a convenience that violated half a dozen security protocols but had been standard practice for months because maintenance staff found it annoying to repeatedly unlock the door. She'd mentioned this in a report. No one had addressed it. Irene walked through the propped-open door at 0628 hours and made her way through maintenance corridors to the stairwell. The administrative building was 5 stories tall, with the Admiral's office on the top floor. She climbed the stairs slowly, listening for any indication that she'd been detected. The building was beginning to wake up. She could hear voices, footsteps, the normal sounds of a naval base starting its daily routine. But no one was looking for an intruder inside the administrative building. Why would they? The building was secure. Except it wasn't. Irene reached the 5th floor and moved down the corridor toward the Admiral's office suite. His outer office would be staffed by his aide, Commander Vasquez, who arrived promptly at 0645 every morning. Irene checked her watch, 0639 hours. 6 minutes before Vasquez arrived. The Admiral's suite was locked, but Irene had noticed that the cleaning crews used a universal access key that they frequently left in the janitor's closet down the hall. She retrieved the key, unlocked the Admiral's outer office, and stepped inside. The inner office door was unlocked. She entered Admiral Hutchinson's personal office, the command center of Naval Base Constantia, and stood for a moment taking in the space. Maps covered one wall, showing naval positions and operational areas. Citations and photographs covered another, documenting a distinguished career. The desk was massive, positioned to look out over the harbor. Irene walked behind the desk and sat in the Admiral's chair. Then she pulled out her notebook and camera, arranging them on the desk surface alongside a detailed written report she'd prepared the night before. Finally, she pulled out a small recording device and activated it, setting it where it would capture everything that happened next. At 0647 hours, she heard Commander Vasquez arrive in the outer office. Footsteps, the sound of a briefcase being set down, the routine beginning of another day. Irene waited silently, her heart pounding but her resolve absolute. This was it. The moment where everything she'd worked toward would either vindicate her concerns or end her career in spectacular failure. Probably both. She heard voices in the outer office now. Multiple people arriving. The alarm about her disappearance must have reached the administrative building. They were looking for her, organizing search teams, initiating protocols for a missing officer. And she was sitting in the Admiral's chair, waiting to teach them all a lesson about the difference between security protocols and actual security. The door to the inner office opened. Commander Vasquez stepped through, already speaking before he looked up from his tablet. "Admiral, we have a situation." one of our junior officers has gone missing in. He stopped mid-sentence, staring at Irene sitting behind the Admiral's desk. She smiled calmly and said, "Good morning, Commander. I'm not missing. I'm completing a security inspection. You'll want to notify Admiral Hutchinson immediately. We have a great deal to discuss." Commander Vasquez stood frozen in the doorway, his tablet halfway to his chest, his expression cycling through confusion, shock, and growing anger. "Officer Hill? What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Irene remained seated, her hands folded calmly on the desk. "I'm demonstrating critical security failures, sir. I entered this base from outside the perimeter at 0420 hours. I penetrated 6 separate secured areas without detection. I accessed this office without authorization. And I've documented everything." Vasquez struggled to find words. "You've compromised security protocols. You've violated about 20 different regulations. I've exposed the fact that our security protocols are worthless," Irene interrupted, her voice steady. "Sir, I've been trying to raise these concerns through proper channels for months. Nobody would listen. So I decided to prove my point in a way that couldn't be ignored." Vasquez pulled out his radio. "Security, this is Commander Vasquez. I need personnel at the Admiral's office immediately. I've located Officer Hill." He looked at Irene with barely controlled fury. "Stay exactly where you are. Don't move. Don't touch anything." "I've already touched everything, sir," Irene replied. "That's the point." Within 3 minutes, the outer office filled with security personnel. Within 5 minutes, Admiral Hutchinson himself arrived, his weathered face stormy as he pushed through the gathered crowd. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that made junior officers instinctively straighten their posture. He stopped in the doorway of his inner office, taking in the scene, Irene Hill, his assistant protocol officer, sitting calmly behind his desk, surrounded by notebooks, cameras, and recording equipment. "Officer Hill," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Explain yourself. Now." Irene stood, coming to attention. "Sir, at 0420 hours this morning, I initiated an unauthorized security inspection of Naval Base Constantia. I successfully penetrated base perimeter defenses, accessed multiple restricted areas, and entered your personal office without detection. I've documented systematic security failures that make this base vulnerable to hostile action." Hutchinson's jaw tightened. "You initiated an unauthorized. You do realize you've just confessed to multiple serious violations? That you're facing court-martial?" "Yes, sir. I understand completely." Irene gestured to the materials on his desk. "I also understand that this base has ignored critical security vulnerabilities for months. Sir, with respect, I tried to report these issues through proper channels. My reports were dismissed. My concerns were ignored. So I demonstrated them instead. By violating every security protocol we have?" Vasquez interjected. "By proving that those protocols aren't working," Irene replied. She picked up her notebook. "Sir, I have detailed documentation of every security failure I encountered. The northern observation post was unmanned and the guard was watching videos on their phone. The technical building was accessible with a 4-month-old entry code. The harbor perimeter has 4 separate unsecured access points. And I walked into this office using a key that cleaning crews leave in an unlocked closet." Hutchinson's expression shifted slightly, the anger mixing with something else. Concern, perhaps. Or recognition. "You documented all of this?" "Yes, sir. Photographs, timestamps, detailed notes. Everything you need to understand exactly how vulnerable we are." The Admiral moved into his office, gesturing for the security personnel to wait outside. Only Commander Vasquez remained, standing stiffly by the door. Hutchinson picked up Irene's notebook and began reading, his frown deepening with each page. The silence stretched for nearly 5 minutes as he reviewed her documentation. Finally, He set the notebook down and looked at Irene with an expression she couldn't quite read. Officer Hill, you understand that what you've done is completely unacceptable. You violated direct orders, compromised security protocols, and acted with total disregard for the chain of command. Yes, sir. You also appear to have identified legitimate security concerns that should have been addressed months ago. He glanced at Vasquez. Commander, I want to know why Officer Hill's previous reports weren't properly reviewed. Vasquez shifted uncomfortably. Sir, the reports seemed overly detailed. We didn't think. You didn't think a protocol officer might actually understand protocols? Hutchinson's voice carried an edge. He turned back to Irene. Officer Hill, you're confined to quarters pending a full investigation. You'll face disciplinary action for your unauthorized activities. However, he tapped her notebook, you'll also be required to brief our security review team on every failure you've identified. Irene felt something loosen in her chest. Not vindication, not yet. But acknowledgement. Finally, someone was listening. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. As security personnel escorted her from the office, Irene caught a final glimpse of Admiral Hutchinson studying her photographs of the harbor, his expression grave. She'd risked everything to make him see the truth. Now she just had to hope that the truth had been worth the cost. The interrogation room in Building 12 was exactly as uncomfortable as Irene had expected. Gray walls, a metal table, 2 chairs, and a mirror that was obviously one-way glass. She'd been sitting here for 3 hours, alone with her thoughts and a growing sense that her dramatic demonstration might have consequences she hadn't fully anticipated. The door opened and 2 officers entered. Captain Helena Voss, head of base security, and Lieutenant Commander Julian Cross from Naval Intelligence. Voss was in her 40s, with sharp features and sharper eyes. Cross was younger, methodical in his movements as he arranged a thick folder on the table between them. Officer Hill, Voss began, settling into her chair. You've created quite a situation. Yes, ma'am, Irene replied. That was the intention. The intention was to embarrass base command? To undermine security protocols? To prove how clever you are? Voss's tone was cutting. The intention was to prevent actual security breaches by demonstrating our vulnerabilities, Irene said evenly. Ma'am, I tried. We know what you tried, Cross interrupted, opening his folder. We've reviewed your previous reports. All 17 of them, dating back 9 months. Detailed observations about patrol patterns, equipment failures, protocol violations. He looked up. Impressive documentation, actually. Also completely ignored by your chain of command. Voss shot Cross a warning look, but he continued. The question isn't whether you identified legitimate problems, Officer Hill. The question is whether your methods were justified. My methods were the only option left, Irene replied. I exhausted every proper channel. I submitted reports, requested meetings, followed protocol exactly. And I was dismissed at every turn because I'm a junior officer in an administrative role. Because people couldn't imagine that someone like me might see things they'd missed. Someone like you? Voss asked. Young. Female. Small. Forgettable. Irene met Voss's eyes directly. Ma'am, I've spent 11 months being invisible. Guards talk freely around me because they don't think I matter. Officers discuss security issues in my presence because they assume I'm not paying attention. I've been dismissed so consistently that I became background noise. And that gave me perspective that the security personnel themselves don't have. Cross made notes in his folder. Walk us through your unauthorized inspection. Every step, starting from when you left your quarters. For the next 2 hours, Irene provided detailed testimony about her activities. Every security failure she'd identified, every access point she'd penetrated, every protocol violation she'd documented. Voss's expression grew increasingly concerned as the testimony continued. Cross's notes filled page after page. The drainage culvert beneath the harbor road, Voss said finally. You're saying the protective grade has been damaged for months? Yes, ma'am. I reported it in my August submission. The damage is visible in my photographs from this morning. Voss and Cross exchanged glances. We'll need to verify everything you've claimed, Voss said. But if even half of this is accurate, we have serious problems. It's all accurate, ma'am, Irene replied. I wouldn't have risked my career on exaggerations. The interrogation continued through the afternoon. By 1600 hours, Irene had answered hundreds of questions, clarified dozens of details, and watched both officers' attitudes shift from skeptical to deeply troubled. Whatever discipline she faced, at least her concerns were finally being taken seriously. CTA, we've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. As the interrogation concluded, Cross gathered his materials. Officer Hill, you'll remain confined to quarters while we complete our investigation. You're not to discuss this matter with anyone outside the review team. Understood? Yes, sir. Voss stood, studying Irene with an expression that might have been grudging respect. For what it's worth, Officer Hill, your observations were thorough. Your methods, however, were reckless and could have gotten you killed. If there had been actual hostile actors on this base, your unauthorized activities could have ended very differently. Yes, ma'am. I understood the risks. Did you? Voss leaned forward. Because from where I'm sitting, you took extraordinary risks to prove a point that you could have proven through persistent advocacy within proper channels. With respect, ma'am, I tried persistent advocacy for 9 months. It achieved nothing except being labeled as someone who didn't understand their place. Voss's expression softened slightly. I've read your file, Hill. Top marks at the academy. Excellent performance reviews. Consistently requesting field assignments and consistently being placed in administrative roles. You think you've been typecast? I know I have, ma'am. Maybe, Voss acknowledged. Or maybe you're exactly where you're most valuable, and you just haven't recognized it yet. She moved toward the door, then paused. The security review will take several days. Use that time to think about whether proving everyone wrong was worth potentially ending your career. After they left, Irene sat alone in the interrogation room for another 20 minutes before an escort arrived to take her back to quarters. As she walked across the base in the evening light, she noticed personnel watching her. Word had spread about the junior officer who'd penetrated base security and humiliated command. Some faces showed admiration. Others showed disapproval. Most showed simple curiosity about the small woman who'd caused such chaos. Back in her quarters, Irene finally allowed herself to feel the exhaustion of the past 20 hours. She'd accomplished what she'd set out to do, forced command to acknowledge security failures they'd been ignoring. But Captain Voss's question haunted her. Had proving everyone wrong been worth potentially ending her career? Irene looked at her reflection in the small mirror above her sink. The same forgettable face that had served her so well during her unauthorized inspection stared back, now marked by exhaustion and uncertainty. She'd find out soon enough whether her gamble had paid off. The security review began in earnest the following morning. Irene watched from her quarters window as teams of personnel descended on every location she'd documented. The Northern Observation Post. The Technical Building. The Drainage Culvert. Each site became a hub of activity as security specialists verified her claims and assessed the failures she'd exposed. By day 3, the base was transformed. New guards appeared at previously unmonitored positions. Maintenance crews repaired equipment that had been neglected for months. Protocol reviews were conducted across every department. Naval Base Constantia was experiencing a security overhaul, and everyone knew it had been triggered by a junior protocol officer's unauthorized inspection. Commander Vasquez arrived at Irene's quarters on the afternoon of day 4, his expression neutral but less hostile than during their last encounter. Officer Hill, you're wanted in the conference room. The review board is ready to hear your formal testimony. The conference room in the administrative building was filled with senior officers. Admiral Hutchinson sat at the head of the table, flanked by Captain Voss and Lieutenant Commander Cross. Also present were 3 officers Irene didn't recognize, their uniforms indicating they were from Naval Command Headquarters on the mainland. "Officer Hill," Hutchinson began once she was seated. "The security review has been completed. We've verified your documentation and assessed the vulnerabilities you identified. Captain Voss will present the findings." Voss stood, activating a presentation on the wall screen. Officer Hill identified 23 separate security failures during her unauthorized inspection. We've confirmed 21 of them. The remaining 2 were actually more serious than her initial assessment suggested. She clicked through slides showing photographs from Irene's inspection alongside current security improvements. The Northern Observation Post had been operating with minimal staffing for 6 months. The technical building's access codes hadn't been changed in 7 months, not 4 as Officer Hill reported. The harbor drainage system had 3 compromised access points, not just the one she used. One of the officers from headquarters spoke up. "And these failures existed despite multiple reports from Officer Hill?" "Yes, sir," Voss confirmed. "We've reviewed 17 separate reports she submitted over 9 months. Each was technically accurate. Most were dismissed as overly detailed or outside her area of responsibility." The headquarters officer turned to Hutchinson. "Admiral, how did such consistent failures and oversight occur?" Hutchinson's jaw tightened. "That's being addressed through separate channels, sir. The immediate question is how to proceed regarding Officer Hill's actions. She violated numerous protocols," another headquarters officer noted. "Unauthorized departure from base, penetration of restricted areas, disregard for direct orders. These are serious infractions. She also potentially prevented actual security breaches by hostile actors," Cross interjected. "Sir, if Officer Hill could penetrate our defenses, so could trained operatives. She gave us a warning instead of an attack." "A warning delivered through insubordination," Vasquez pointed out. The room fell silent as the officers considered the contradiction, an officer who had violated protocols to expose the failure of those same protocols. Irene sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, waiting for judgment. Finally, Admiral Hutchinson spoke. "Officer Hill, stand." Irene rose to attention, her heart pounding. "Your actions were unauthorized, inappropriate, and demonstrated serious disregard for military discipline," Hutchinson said formally. "You will receive an official reprimand in your service record. You'll also be required to complete additional training in proper reporting procedures and chain of command protocols." Irene's heart sank. A reprimand would effectively end any chance of field assignments or advancement. However, Hutchinson continued, and something in his tone made her look up. "Your observations were accurate, your documentation was thorough, and your persistence in raising concerns, even when dismissed, showed commitment to this base's security that exceeded your assigned duties." He glanced at the headquarters officers. "Naval Command has reviewed your file. They've authorized a transfer." Transfer. Not dismissal. Not court-martial. Irene hardly dared to hope. One of the headquarters officers stood. "Officer Hill, you're being reassigned to the Naval Security Assessment Division, effective immediately. Your new role will be to conduct authorized security inspections at naval installations throughout the Mediterranean. You'll identify vulnerabilities, assess protocols, and provide recommendations for improvements." Irene stared, struggling to process what she was hearing. Not punishment. Promotion. Recognition. "The position comes with promotion to lieutenant," the officer continued. "You'll report directly to Naval Command and will have authority to conduct inspections without prior notification to base commanders. Your observations will carry weight of official assessments rather than dismissed junior officer reports." "Sir, Irene's voice caught. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank us yet," Captain Voss said with a slight smile. "You'll be making a lot of senior officers very uncomfortable with your inspections. But that appears to be something you're good at." Admiral Hutchinson stepped forward. "Officer Hill, Lieutenant Hill, I dismissed your concerns because I couldn't see past your rank and your role. That was a failure of leadership on my part. You proved that security requires constant vigilance, regardless of who's providing that vigilance." He extended his hand. Irene shook it, feeling the weight of recognition she'd been seeking for 11 months. As the meeting concluded and officers filed out, Cross approached her quietly. "Congratulations, Lieutenant. Though I should mention that your first assignment is going to be interesting." "Sir?" "Naval Base Diomedes. They've been operating under the same security protocols for 15 years. Command wants you to conduct a comprehensive assessment." He smiled slightly. "I suspect you're going to find plenty to document." Irene smiled back, feeling something shift inside her. Not just validation, but purpose. She'd spent 11 months being invisible, being dismissed, being told her observations didn't matter. Now her observations would be her career. 2 weeks later, Irene stood on the deck of the transport vessel approaching Naval Base Diomedes, watching the facility emerge from the morning mist. The base was larger than Constantia, home to twice as many personnel and significantly more naval assets. It was also, according to her briefing materials, considered one of the most secure installations in the Mediterranean. Which meant it was probably overconfident. Possibly complacent. Definitely worth inspecting. Lieutenant Commander Cross had traveled with her to provide support for her first official assessment. He stood beside her now, reviewing files on his tablet. Diomedes has had the same security chief for 12 years. Captain Andrus. Career security officer, highly decorated, absolutely convinced his protocols are flawless. "Those are always the most interesting ones," Irene replied. "He's also not particularly happy about this inspection. Naval Command didn't give him advance notice, per your new operational authority. He found out you were coming about 6 hours ago." "Good. Can't improve security if people have time to hide their problems." Cross smiled. "You've adapted to this role quickly." "I've been preparing for it for 11 months, sir. Just didn't know that's what I was doing." The transport docked at 0900 hours. Irene gathered her equipment, official now, issued by Naval Command rather than secretly accumulated, and prepared to begin her assessment. As she descended the gangway, she saw a welcoming committee of 3 officers led by a stern-faced man in his 50s with security insignia on his uniform. Captain Andrus, obviously. And he did not look pleased. "Lieutenant Hill," he said, his greeting barely cordial. "Welcome to Diomedes. I'm Captain Andrus, Chief of Security. I understand you're here to conduct an assessment of our protocols." "That's correct, sir," Irene replied. "I'll be conducting a comprehensive review over the next 72 hours. "Comprehensive," Andrus repeated, his tone suggesting he found the word offensive. "Lieutenant, Diomedes has maintained perfect security for 12 years. No breaches, no incidents, no failures. I'm not sure what you expect to find." "That's exactly what I expect to assess, sir. Whether your perfect record reflects actual security or simply an absence of challenges." Andrus's jaw tightened. "I've reviewed the report from Constantia. I'm aware of your methods. Let me be clear, Lieutenant. If you attempt any unauthorized activities at this base, you'll be detained immediately. We take security seriously here." "I'm sure you do, sir," Irene replied calmly. "That's why I'll be conducting an authorized assessment rather than an unauthorized demonstration. Though I should mention that my assessment will be thorough. If vulnerabilities exist, I'll find them. There are no vulnerabilities to find." Irene smiled slightly. "We'll see, sir." The tension between them was palpable as Andrus led them toward the administrative building. Cross caught Irene's eye and gave a subtle nod of approval. She'd established her authority immediately, made clear she wouldn't be intimidated by senior officers who resented her presence. Over the next 3 days, Irene conducted the most comprehensive security assessment of her career. She reviewed patrol logs, tested equipment, interviewed personnel, and observed operations from multiple vantage points. And slowly, systematically, she began identifying the patterns that revealed Diomedes' truth. The security wasn't perfect. It was rigid. Andrus had implemented protocols that looked impressive on paper but created predictable patterns that could be exploited. Guards followed routes so precise that timing them became trivial. Access procedures were so standardized that anyone who understood them once could predict them indefinitely. Equipment was maintained excellently but was all of the same generation, meaning a single technological vulnerability could compromise multiple systems simultaneously. Perfect security, Irene was learning, was often the most vulnerable kind. Because it assumed perfection was possible, it stopped evolving, stopped adapting, stopped questioning itself. On her final day at Diomedes, Irene presented her preliminary findings to Andrus and his senior staff. The conference room was filled with security personnel, all of whom clearly expected vindication of their perfect record. Captain Andrus, Irene began, activating her presentation. Your security protocols at Diomedes are comprehensive and well documented. Your personnel are well trained and disciplined. Your equipment is well maintained. By traditional measures, your security is excellent. Andrus nodded, vindicated. As I indicated, Lieutenant. However, Irene continued, excellent security isn't the same as effective security. Your protocols create predictable patterns. Your guards follow routes that can be timed to the minute. Your access procedures haven't been updated in 8 years, making them potentially compromised by anyone who understood them previously. And your equipment standardization means a single exploit could cascade through multiple systems. The room's mood shifted. Andrus's expression darkened. Irene continued through slide after slide, documenting vulnerabilities not through unauthorized penetration but through careful observation and analysis. She showed how patrol patterns created regular gaps in coverage. How procedural rigidity made adaptation difficult. How commitment to proven methods prevented evolution of security practices. Lieutenant Hill, Andrus interrupted finally. Are you suggesting that 12 years of incident-free security is somehow inadequate? I'm suggesting that 12 years without incidents might reflect luck rather than invulnerability, sir, Irene replied. Effective security doesn't just prevent breaches. It anticipates evolution of threats and adapts accordingly. Your security hasn't evolved in 8 years. That's not strength, it's stagnation. The silence in the room was absolute. Then one of Andrus's staff officers spoke up. Lieutenant, you mentioned procedural rigidity. Can you elaborate? Over the next hour, Irene walked them through her findings not as criticism but as opportunity for improvement. She showed them how small adjustments could eliminate pattern predictability. How updated procedures could maintain security while reducing exploitable rigidity. How diversity in equipment generations could prevent cascade failures. By the end of her presentation, even Andrus's resistance had softened to grudging consideration. You'll have my full report within 48 hours, Irene concluded. Sir, Diomedes has strong fundamentals. With adaptations, it could have genuinely robust security rather than rigid security. As the meeting dispersed, Cross approached with barely concealed amusement. You just told a decorated security chief that his perfect record was mostly luck. And somehow convinced half his staff you were right. Irene smiled. Not luck, sir. Just incomplete security. Which is fixable. You're going to make a lot of enemies in this role. Probably, Irene agreed. But I'll also make bases safer. That matters more than being liked. As they prepared to depart Diomedes, Andrus approached Irene one final time. Lieutenant Hill, I disagreed with your assessment initially. But after reviewing your detailed findings. He paused, pride warring with honesty. You identified legitimate concerns. We'll implement your recommendations. Thank you, sir. That's all I hoped for. Back aboard the transport, heading toward her next assignment, Irene stood on deck watching Diomedes fade into the distance. She'd been invisible for so long, dismissed and forgotten. Now she was making senior officers reconsider everything they thought they knew about security. It was, she reflected, exactly the career she'd been preparing for all along. She just had to prove everyone wrong first. The reputation preceded her arrival at Naval Base Artemis. Irene could see it in the faces of the officers who met her transport vessel, in the way security personnel straightened their postures as she passed, in the nervous energy that hummed through the base like an electrical current. Lieutenant Hill was coming. The officer who had embarrassed Constantia's command and challenged Diomedes' perfection. The inspector who found vulnerabilities that everyone else had missed. Artemis was her third assignment in 5 weeks. The pace was relentless, but Irene thrived on it. Each base presented new challenges, new patterns to decode, new assumptions to question. She developed a methodology during her inspections: observe first, document everything, challenge respectfully, and provide solutions rather than just criticism. Commander Eleni Roussos, Artemis's executive officer, escorted Irene through the facility. Unlike Andrus's hostility or Constantia's dismissiveness, Roussos projected cautious professionalism. Lieutenant Hill, we've reviewed your reports from previous assessments. We've also implemented several preemptive improvements based on common vulnerabilities you've identified elsewhere. That's excellent initiative, ma'am, Irene replied. Though I'll still conduct a full independent assessment. Of course. I wouldn't expect otherwise. Roussos paused near the command center. Lieutenant, can I speak candidly? Please, ma'am. Your methods at Constantia were effective but controversial. Some officers see you as someone who circumvents authority to prove points. Others see you as essential oversight that command structures often lack. Which perspective is accurate? Irene considered the question carefully. Ma'am, I believe both are partially true. I did circumvent authority at Constantia, and I accept the reprimand I received. But I also believe that sometimes systems fail not because individuals are incompetent, but because those systems don't allow for perspectives that challenge established assumptions. I was dismissed for months because I didn't fit people's expectations of who could identify security problems. And now you're the person who identifies those problems professionally. Yes, ma'am. With authorization rather than against it. Which is considerably more effective. Roussos smiled slightly. I suspect you're going to find things here that we've missed. I'm actually hoping you do. Better you than hostile actors. The assessment at Artemis took 4 days rather than 3. The base was complex, with multiple operational areas that required separate analysis. Irene worked 16-hour days, interviewing personnel, reviewing logs, testing systems, and gradually building a comprehensive picture of Artemis's security posture. What she found surprised her. Artemis had implemented many best practices. Their patrol patterns varied regularly. Their equipment was diverse and well-maintained. Their procedures were updated quarterly. Commander Roussos's preemptive improvements had addressed several common vulnerabilities. But Irene also found something more subtle, a cultural problem that no amount of procedural improvement could fix. Personnel at Artemis were following protocols perfectly. Too perfectly. When she interviewed guards, they recited procedures word for word from training manuals. When she observed patrols, they executed routes with mechanical precision. When she asked about unusual situations, personnel consistently responded that they would follow established protocols and report through proper channels. It was security built on compliance rather than judgment. And compliance without judgment was brittle, effective until confronted with situations that didn't fit established procedures. On her final evening at Artemis, Irene requested a meeting with Roussos and the base commander, Admiral Yanis Demos. She prepared her presentation carefully, knowing that criticizing culture was more sensitive than identifying procedural gaps. Admiral, Commander, she began, Artemis has excellent security protocols. Your procedures are comprehensive, your personnel are well-trained, and your equipment is properly maintained. By most measures, your security is exemplary. Demos nodded, clearly expecting validation. He was in his early 60s, with the bearing of an officer who'd built his career on discipline and order. However, Irene continued, I've identified a potential vulnerability that concerns me. Your personnel are following protocols perfectly, but they're not demonstrating security awareness beyond those protocols. When I've presented hypothetical scenarios that fall outside standard procedures, most personnel default to following established guidelines rather than adapting to the specific situation. Roussos leaned forward. You're saying our people are too rigid? I'm saying they're trained to comply rather than trained to think, Irene replied. Which means they'll respond effectively to predictable threats but potentially struggle with unconventional approaches. Real hostile actors don't follow our procedures. They exploit gaps between what our protocols expect and what actually happens. Demos's expression hardened. Lieutenant, my personnel are trained to the highest standards. Are you suggesting that discipline is somehow a weakness? No, sir. I'm suggesting that discipline without adaptability creates predictable responses. And predictability is exploitable. Irene pulled up examples from her observation notes. When I interviewed guards about irregular situations, 70% gave responses that essentially meant I would follow the rulebook. Only 30% demonstrated thinking beyond protocol to address the specific context of each scenario. Because following protocol is exactly what they should do, Demos replied sharply. We have procedures for a reason, Lieutenant. Encouraging personnel to improvise undermines the structure that keeps this base secure. Irene had anticipated this resistance. Sir, I'm not suggesting improvisation. I'm suggesting judgment. The ability to recognize when situations require adaptation of standard responses while maintaining security principles. The meeting grew tense as Demos defended his approach and Irene carefully pressed her point. Unlike Constantia, where she'd been dismissed, or Diomedes, where she'd faced hostility, here she encountered a different challenge, a commander who genuinely believed his approach was correct and saw her suggestions as undermining rather than improving his security. Finally, Roussos intervened. Admiral, perhaps we could implement Lieutenant Hill's suggestions as supplementary training rather than replacement of existing protocols. Scenario-based exercises that test judgment within procedural frameworks. It was a diplomatic compromise. Demos considered it, then nodded reluctantly. Very well. Lieutenant Hill, work with Commander Roussos to develop supplementary training materials. But understand that at Artemis, discipline and protocol remain paramount. Yes, sir, Irene replied, recognizing a partial victory. Later, as she prepared her formal report, Cross contacted her via secure communication. How's Artemis? Complicated, Irene replied. Good security, resistant commander. I'm learning that identifying problems is easier than convincing people to address them. Welcome to professional security assessment, Cross said with amusement. Not everyone appreciates being told they have room for improvement. Apparently not, sir. Your next assignment is going to be different, Cross continued. Naval Command wants you to return to Constantia. Conduct a follow-up assessment to verify that improvements were implemented and sustained. Irene felt her stomach tighten. Return to Constantia. Face Admiral Hutchinson again. Walk through the base where she'd been invisible for 11 months before risking everything to prove her worth. When do I leave, sir? 3 days. Prepare yourself, Lieutenant. Going back is always harder than moving forward. As the call ended, Irene looked out at the Mediterranean evening, thinking about the base where this had all begun. She'd left Constantia in disgrace and vindication simultaneously, her career balanced on the edge of disaster and opportunity. Now she was returning as the inspector who'd sparked everything. The question was whether Constantia had truly changed, or just temporarily adjusted until the scrutiny passed. She'd find out soon enough. The transport vessel approached Naval Base Constantia on a bright afternoon, the familiar outline of the base triggering a complicated mix of emotions in Irene. 3 months had passed since her unauthorized inspection, 3 months of intensive work across multiple installations. She'd changed during that time, grown more confident, more skilled at navigating resistance, more certain of her purpose. But Constantia was where it had all started. Where she'd been invisible. Where she'd risked everything. Admiral Hutchinson himself met her at the dock, along with Commander Vasquez and Captain Voss. Their presence signaled that this follow-up assessment carried significant weight. Hutchinson extended his hand as she descended the gangway. "Lieutenant Hill. Welcome back to Constantia." "Thank you, sir." Irene shook his hand, noting that his greeting held none of the anger from their previous encounter. "I'm here to conduct a follow-up security assessment and verify implementation of recommended improvements." "We've made substantial changes," Hutchinson replied. "Captain Voss will brief you on everything we've implemented." The briefing took place in the same conference room where Irene had presented her findings 3 months earlier. But the atmosphere was completely different. Then, she'd been defending unauthorized actions while exposing failures. Now, she was conducting official assessment while command demonstrated their improvements. Voss's presentation was comprehensive. "We've implemented all 21 primary recommendations from your initial report. Patrol patterns have been randomized and are now changed weekly. Access codes are updated every 15 days across all facilities. The technical building has enhanced security protocols including biometric verification. The harbor perimeter has been completely renovated with new drainage systems and reinforced barriers." Irene reviewed the documentation, impressed by the thoroughness. "These are excellent implementations, Captain. Have you conducted any testing to verify effectiveness?" "We've run multiple drill scenarios," Voss replied. "All showed significant improvement over baseline security posture." "Drills are valuable, but they're predictable," Irene noted. "With your permission, Admiral, I'd like to conduct unannounced testing of your security measures. Not unauthorized penetration like before, but authorized stress testing where your personnel don't know they're being evaluated." Hutchinson exchanged glances with Voss, then nodded. "Authorized testing only, Lieutenant. I don't need another incident report explaining why my security inspector was detained by my own guards." "Understood, sir. Everything will be coordinated through Captain Voss's office, even if the specific timing isn't announced to base personnel." Over the next week, Irene conducted the most thorough assessment of her career. She tested response times by simulating various scenarios. She interviewed personnel about their understanding of new procedures. She observed operations from multiple perspectives. And gradually, she built a picture not just of what had changed, but whether those changes had created lasting improvement or temporary compliance. The results were mixed. Some areas showed genuine transformation. The technical building's security was dramatically improved, with personnel demonstrating real understanding of why procedures mattered. The harbor perimeter was physically more secure, with new barriers that eliminated the vulnerabilities she'd exploited. But other areas showed superficial compliance. Guards followed new patrol patterns because they were ordered to, not because they understood the reasoning. Some personnel still viewed security procedures as bureaucratic requirements rather than essential practices. The improvements were real, but the underlying culture hadn't fully shifted. Across the region, assessment teams began their work. At Constantia, where it had all started, Lieutenant Marcus Webb was evaluating whether security improvements had been sustained over the past year. At Diomedes, Lieutenant Elena Vassos was testing whether the base had moved beyond rigid protocols to adaptive security. At Artemis, a team was assessing whether cultural training had transformed compliance into genuine awareness. And at Olympus, Irene herself would conduct the follow-up evaluation, verifying whether Admiral Petrides had truly transformed his base's approach to security. The return to Olympus felt different from her first visit. Then, she'd been an unwelcome inspector challenging a commander's pride. Now, she was the division head whose recommendations had reshaped security practices fleet-wide. Petrides met her at the secure dock with an expression that mixed respect and wariness. "Commander Hill. Welcome back to Olympus." "Thank you, Admiral. I'm here to verify implementation of our previous recommendations and assess sustained security improvements." You'll find we've made substantial changes, Petrides replied. Our assessment methodology has been completely revised. We've implemented randomized testing protocols. And most significantly, we've created a culture where identifying problems is valued rather than discouraged. Over 3 days, Irene conducted the most thorough follow-up assessment of her career. What she found exceeded expectations. Olympus had genuinely transformed, not just implementing procedural changes but embracing the principle that perfect records meant nothing if they concealed imperfections. The internal security team now conducted genuine evaluations rather than verification checklists. Personnel demonstrated judgment alongside compliance. And most importantly, command culture supported identifying vulnerabilities rather than maintaining appearances. You've accomplished remarkable transformation, Admiral, Irene told Petrides during their final meeting. Olympus is now one of the most genuinely secure installations in the fleet, not because you maintain perfect records, but because you maintain constant vigilance. Petrides smiled slightly. I resisted everything you told me initially. Defended perfection that was partially illusion. You forced me to recognize that genuine security requires humility, acknowledging what we don't know and maintaining openness to discovering what we've missed. That's the foundation of effective security, sir. Constant questioning, constant adaptation, constant willingness to acknowledge imperfection as opportunity for improvement. As Irene prepared to depart Olympus, she received communication from her operations center. All 5 simultaneous assessments had been completed. The results showed mixed progress. Some bases had sustained improvements, others had reverted to old patterns, all had areas requiring continued attention. Which was exactly what security assessment should reveal. Not perfection, but realistic evaluation of ongoing challenges. Back at the Security Assessment Office, Irene briefed her team on Operation Clearview's results. Gentlemen and ladies, we've completed our first coordinated evaluation. The findings demonstrate both progress and persistent challenges across the fleet. Our job isn't to achieve perfect security, it's to maintain constant evaluation that prevents complacency. Lieutenant Okafor raised her hand. Commander, several base commanders have already requested follow-up meetings to discuss our findings. They're actually eager for our recommendations rather than resistant to them. That's the cultural shift we've been working toward, Irene replied. Making security assessment valued rather than feared. Making vulnerability identification seen as strength rather than weakness. That evening, alone in her office, Irene reviewed reports from across the fleet. 1 year ago, she'd been a dismissed protocol officer whose concerns were ignored. Now, her division shaped security practices for thousands of personnel across dozens of installations. The journey had required risk. Required defying expectations. Required proving that size, rank, and traditional career paths didn't determine who could identify threats and protect lives. She thought about all the people who'd dismissed her, Commander Petrakis who'd ignored her reports, Lieutenant Colonel Dreyfus who'd told her security wasn't her expertise, Admiral Hutchinson who'd initially seen her unauthorized inspection as insubordination rather than dedication. They'd all been wrong. Not because they were incompetent, but because they couldn't imagine that someone like her, young, small, in an administrative role, might see security failures that they'd missed. Creating the Security Assessment Office meant ensuring that perspective would never again be dismissed. That unconventional observers would be valued. That questioning assumptions would be standard practice rather than career-ending risk. Irene's desk held a photograph from her academy graduation, a younger version of herself standing among classmates, already being typecast as administrative rather than operational. She'd spent years fighting that categorization, trying to prove she belonged in field roles. Now she understood that her administrative role at Constantia had been exactly where she needed to be. Not despite her assignment, but because of it. Being underestimated had allowed her to observe without being noticed. Being dismissed had taught her to see what others missed. Being invisible had been her greatest advantage. The Security Assessment Office would institutionalize those advantages, would create systems where unconventional perspectives were valued, where questioning authority was authorized, where identifying imperfections was mission rather than insubordination. Admiral Castellano had asked her to build a division that would tell commanders uncomfortable truths. She'd built something more, a division that would ensure security was never again assumed but always evaluated, never complacent but always adaptive, never perfect but always improving. 1 year ago, Admiral Hutchinson had thought she was lost when she disappeared from Constantia. In reality, she'd been conducting the inspection that would transform her career and reshape security practices across the entire fleet. Now, as division commander, she ensured that no base could assume its security was adequate without constant evaluation proving it true. The young protocol officer who'd once been too small to matter had become the commander whose assessments mattered most. And across the Mediterranean fleet, security was stronger because someone had been willing to prove that limitations were only real if you accepted them. Irene smiled and began reviewing the next week's assessment schedule. The work never ended. Security required constant vigilance. Fortunately, she'd built a division dedicated to exactly that. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.